Hi there, and welcome to another episode of the Bike Catalogue. In today's episode, I'm going to be talking to you about purchasing a second-hand bicycle and the things you should think about when doing so. So whether that's being a purchase from eBay or Facebook, or whether it's a friend selling you an old bike, these are some of the things that you should think about when you go to purchase. My example with me today is a Live Envy Advance 1 from 2017. Now this bike has recently been purchased second hand, and so a few of the things that I went about when I actually picked up this bike are a few of the tips that I'm going to be trying to share in this video today. My first tip is make sure you can actually go and look at the bike. I know you can see some great deals on eBay or Facebook, but actually going to see the bike in the flesh and being able to touch it and see the condition of it makes a massive difference. Yes, you can trust some really good sellers online, but I think the confidence you can gain from actually going to hold the bike, see what it feels like, and also importantly, actually checking to see if you like it in flesh makes a massive difference. That also then sort of leads on to the next point, is if you go and visit the bike, you can actually generally take it for a little test ride around their local road just to see if it actually fits you. You're not going to have the security of going into a bike shop and being able to have someone in there actually help you pick your bike and pick the right size. You're going to be totally dependent on looking at your online research and checking whether or not you think you've got the right size. So being able to test ride it will make a really big difference. When you actually get to the bike, the first thing you really want to look for is whether or not it's clean, because that's the easiest giveaway as to whether or not it's been looked after. Now it might have been, it's just been sat in a garage for a while and so it's just covered in dust. But it could have also just been ridden a hell of a lot and it's just caked in mud, the chain, the cassette, everything looks absolutely filthy. If that's the case, well, it's going to be difficult to really get a good inspection of all the components on it, but it's also probably going to make you question just how well it's been looked after before you. And if you're spending a lot of money, you probably want to know that this bike has been looked after. The other big thing is, if the bike is absolutely caked in mud, then it's going to be difficult to see if there are any cracks or dents on the frame. So that leads me on to my next tip. Starting from the front of the bike and working backwards, look over the frame. Run your fingers if you feel like there are any dents and look for any small little cracks. Chances are, if it's a carbon frame and there's a crack, don't bother. I wouldn't risk touching it. It might just be a superficial paint scratch, but you don't know that and you don't want to risk going out riding and it snapping. A metal bike, so an aluminium or a titanium or a steel, there's a little bit more flexibility if there's a slight dent in it. You can get away with riding that. But take your time, work from the front to the back, looking over everything, checking to see if there are any cracks or little hairline breaks in the frame. Hold the bicycle up and spin the wheels. Have a look to see if they spin nice and straight. If they don't, you might be able to get them trued up by a mechanic, but you may also just have to replace them, and that can be a really expensive cost. If the frame looks okay, then the next job is to go on to checking actually the components and seeing if they're in good working order. Now, one of the first places I start is the saddle. Now that's because chances are you're going to have to adjust how high your saddle is so it actually fits you. So my top tip is take a multi-tool with you. So that way you can check whether or not you can undo the seatbelt clamp and do it back up again. Now a lot of these modern sort of aero bikes have these clamp designs which are inbuilt within the frame. Now these can quite often get seized up, and there's a very good chance if it has just been sat there for years, then that seatbelt clamp is going to be seized and you're unlikely to be able to move that saddle. Again, if that's the case, I probably wouldn't go touching the bike. Yes, there are lots of ways that you can try and free up a seized seat post, but just think about what that possibly means. How long's it been sat there? Has it just sort of been soaked in condensation for years and all the parts have seized up? Make the most of being able to actually be there with your multi-tool and check whether or not you can undo it and move it around. You've got to make this bike fit you. There's no point in trying to adapt yourself to whoever the previous owner was. Now the next thing you're going to want to do is check if the components are worn or not. Now a really simple thing you can do is take with you a chain checker tool. Now these only cost a couple of pounds from most online retailers, and what they allow you to do is just drop it into the chain and check how worn the chain is. Now, if that bike's been used for a long time, then you'll see that the chain is clearly stretched, and you should then factor that into purchasing new chain for yourself. Now that's going to add on, cheapest sort of scenario, maybe around £20. But chances are, if that's also worn, then there's a good set that the cassette is particularly worn out, and maybe the chain rings are too. So chain rings, then you're looking well over £100 to replace those, and cassettes also can be £30–40 upwards. These things quickly add up, and you can tell that just by using a simple little chain checker like this. Brakes are the next thing that you want to have a look at, and actually make sure that they're in good working order. You can take a look at the first instance and just see how worn the rim brake pads actually look like. It's slightly harder on a disc brake bike because you've got to take the wheels out and have a look in between the calipers. But generally, most second-hand bikes at the moment do still seem to be rim brake bikes. Disc brake bikes are the common bike now, but if you're looking at buying a second-hand bike, chances are it's going to have rim brakes. So, firstly, have a look. How worn are the pads? Are you going to need to replace those? They usually have a guide indicator of how much wear they've had, so that might give you an indication as to whether or not you need to buy new ones. Then, have a look at the cables and see if there's much wear around them. If the cables look like they're frayed and old, again, you've got to make sure that your brakes work, and your chances are, if they're frayed, you're going to have to replace them. The next thing, just squeeze the levers. See if they move freely, and, importantly, do they actually make the brakes move? You'll be able to feel an old brake because you'll really struggle to pull the lever. If it's nice and smooth and it springs back, you're in a really good place. Much like checking the brakes, you also want to make sure that the gears actually work. So, whether that's just through a test ride and you're able to run through all the gears and you can check that it all moves freely, or it's just by picking up the bicycle, clicking through a few gears and spinning through, then that's a good indication. I would work all the way up to the easiest gear and check that it still goes into it, and I would go all the way down to the hardest gear. If it struggles to move in between all the gears, it may be because the gear cables have got quite old and worn. Now again, that's something else that you're going to have to replace, so just have a think about that. And if you're a capable home mechanic, then yes, that's an easy job to do. But if you're going to have to take that into a shop to repair, then that's just more and more cost. So you're then looking at parts, so potentially new gear cables, plus the actual mechanic doing the labour. These things do quickly add up. At the front of the bicycle, you have two bearings. You've got an upper headset bearing here and a lower headset bearing here. Now this lower one generally takes all of the water and the mud spray from the front wheel. That can really make it wear out very quickly. So a way to check whether or not the bearings are still in good condition and working well, if you just hold on to the front brakes and you just rock the bike forward, if there's any play in the headset, and it will be really obvious if there is, because you'll hold the handlebars and you'll move them slightly and the frame will stay where it is, that's a good sign that the headset bearings are worn out and need to be replaced. Again, it's going to add further to your cost, but if it feels nice and solid, then brilliant. You've got a really good and well looked after bicycle. Whilst we're talking about the front of the bike, have a look to see where the stem is. If there's lots of room and there are lots of spacers on either side of the stem, then there's a good chance that you can move your handlebars up and down to make it fit you. However, if the previous user has got it cut and has had this steerer tube cut, then there's less room for you to be able to move that stem up and down. Again, that's going to make making your fit that much harder, and is something you should definitely think about. You may see many ads for bikes saying, this bike's only done 250 miles, it's like new. A really easy way to check whether that actually is the case is by having a look at the tyres. Usually there are little dimples around the tyres, and these are wear indicators. If you can't see those dimples at all, chances are that tyre has been used a lot and you're going to need a new set of tyres, and chances are that bike's not just been ridden 250 miles. Most tyres usually can go for thousands of miles before then they need to be replaced. So that should give you a good idea just how new the bike is. Now we're on to some of the smaller details that you might want to look out for on a bike, but they're all just as important. Now again, with your multi-tool, it's worth just checking whether or not you can remove the bottle cage bolts. You're going to want to take water with you when you go on a ride. So actually, if you can't undo these, well, the bike doesn't serve a huge amount of purpose to you, because you can only ride it maybe for an hour without water. So if you can't attach a bottle cage to it, it's going to be that much harder to ride. Now there are some extras that you might want to look at when you're picking up this second-hand bike. One of those is pedals. Now quite often you might be able to pick up a second-hand bike that actually includes clipless pedals. As I did with this bike, it came with these Shimano SPD SL pedals, which retail at just under £100 sometimes. So actually that's a big saving on the cost of this bike. Now price. Price is that big important point, whether or not you can even afford to get a bike. Now what I would generally say for any bike that is past a year old, I would pretty much only spend about 50% of what it initially cost. So I take this bike, this is an Envy Advance 1 from 2017. Brand new, it cost £1,700. This bike was purchased second hand for £800. So slightly below that 50%, and it was in absolutely fantastic working order. So there are absolute bargains to be had like that, but it's really difficult to justify spending much more than 50% on older bikes. They're just not worth it. With the availability of finance programs, you can get better bikes for much more realistic prices. So I wouldn't go spending too much on a second-hand bike, at least 50% if it's older than 1 year. Importantly, if you need help, speak to your local bike shop or friends that are into cycling. They'll be able to give you advice as to what to look for. But I hope that this video has been useful in giving you a good guide as to what to look for head to toe from start to finish on your bicycle, and I hope that you're able to pick up some great bargains. Now, if you are looking at a new bike, have a look at the bike catalogue. We've got a comparison tool that means you can look at one bike against another and see what's the best bike for you. Go and take a look at that. Also, if you found this video useful, please make sure to subscribe to this channel, as it really helps us out.